The smell of the Aldercroft office at 7 a.m. was always the same. Cold filter coffee, dry erase marker from the previous afternoon's whiteboard session, and the faint electrical warmth of servers that never fully powered down overnight. I had arrived first for 3 years running. Not because anyone required it, because I had discovered early that the hour before anyone else walked in was the only hour the space felt completely, unambiguously mine. On paper, of course, it was mine. 51% of the equity, documented in a shareholder agreement that ran to 22 pages and which I had read in its entirety 3 times before I signed it. My name first on the incorporation documents filed with the state. Every line of the core product code committed under my credentials. Time-stamped, version-stamped, version-controlled. 1. Linked to my personal developer account from a practice I had developed years before and maintained as a condition of how I worked, not as a precaution. And Patricia, my attorney, had reviewed all of it before the ink was dry on anything. Patricia had been my father's attorney before she was mine. She was in her late 50s, direct, in the way that people are direct when they have spent decades watching people fail to say the essential thing early enough. She had a habit of writing a single word in the margins of every contract she reviewed for me. Survive. Not win. Not thrive. Survive. As if the first order of business was always to ensure you were still standing when the situation resolved, whatever form that resolution took. I had thought, in the beginning, that it was a strange word to choose. Survival was the floor, not the ceiling. I was aiming considerably higher. I would come to understand, over 3 years, exactly what she meant by it. Vivian arrived each morning at around 9:15. She moved through the office the way people move through spaces they have curated personally, which, in fairness, she had. The layout was hers. The reception area, which had the spare quality of a contemporary gallery rather than a service business, was hers. The Danish furniture, the carefully considered color palette, the natural light she had maximized by removing a partition wall in the 2nd month, the lavender diffuser that appeared near the front desk at some point in our 2nd year, and that I had grown so accustomed to, I no longer smelled it consciously. She had a real talent for surfaces, for making environments communicate before anyone inside them had to speak. I had spent 3 years building what was underneath. We met at a product conference during the 2nd year of my freelance career. I was presenting a UX framework I had developed for navigating complex multivariable data interfaces, the kind of structural challenge that most design approaches handled badly, either hiding the complexity from the user in ways that created confusion downstream, or exposing all of it in ways that caused the user to disengage. I had spent 2 years on the problem. I had found what I believed was a genuinely novel path through it, a layered information architecture that surfaced complexity progressively, according to the demonstrated intent of the user rather than a predetermined sequence. It meant the interface was different for every person who used it, not in the visual sense, but in the structural one. I was proud of it. I didn't present well. I was aware of that, had been aware of it since my first attempt at a conference talk years earlier. I had the habit of assuming the audience shared my level of familiarity with the underlying structure, and moving through it at a pace that only worked if they did. Most of the audience had looked politely strained by minute 15. She was in the front row, legal pad, pencil, full attention. When the Q&A opened, every other question was technical. API integration, accessibility compliance, edge cases in the layering logic. She waited until those were done, and asked the only question that wasn't about technology at all. She asked, How do you make something that complex feel inevitable to a person using it? I stopped. I did not have a prepared answer to that, because no one had asked it before, and because it was actually the right question, the question that the entire 2-year problem had been trying to answer, just asked from a different angle. We talked for 4 hours over conference coffee that had been sitting in thermal urns since early morning and tasted accordingly. By the time the hotel bar closed, she had a legal pad covered front and back with ideas, and I had the specific restlessness I had come to recognize by then as the feeling of a problem worth devoting serious time to. Aldercroft Design was incorporated 8 months later. Her name was second on the documents because she had asked to be listed that way. She explained it clearly and without defensiveness. Certain rooms, certain client categories, but certain decision-makers responded differently to seeing a woman's name prominently attached to a professional services firm. It wasn't simply optics, she said. It was accurate information about how the world currently worked, and working within it strategically was more effective than performing indifference to it. I agreed without hesitation. I admired the clarity of the reasoning. The equity split, 51-49, had been my suggestion. I had the technical IP that was the core of what the company would sell. She had the client development skills and the brand sensibility that were the core of how the company would sell it. The 2-point gap acknowledged the IP foundation without being punitive. She accepted it without negotiating. And I read that at the time as trust between co-founders who didn't need to treat each other like adversaries. I would later understand it differently. She knew her 49% would not be the number that mattered. The number that mattered was everything around it. The client relationships built through her introductions, the brand identity established through her design decisions, the reputation assembled through her presence in the specific rooms where decisions were made. The company would, in practice, run through her even if the documentation said otherwise. A 2-point equity difference would never change that. She had thought further ahead than I had, in certain directions. I had thought further ahead than she had in others. For 2 years, the combination worked. Yes, the first major client was Wyndham Group, a mid-tier financial services company looking to overhaul their customer-facing portal. It was a 6-month engagement worth more than everything Aldercroft had billed in the previous 18 months combined. We had pitched 6 firms and lost 4 of them. The Wyndham pitch came together in the way that pitches occasionally come together when both people are operating at the top of what they do, and the timing is right. She walked them through the commercial problem with a clarity that made the business case feel self-evident. I showed them a prototype of the interface approach and let them interact with it for 15 minutes before I said another word. We got the call the following morning. I built the core interface system over the following 11 weeks. Yes, most of the work happened in the evenings, after the office had emptied out. I preferred it that way. The specific productive quiet of a space after hours, when the phone wasn't ringing and no one needed anything decided. I would come in at 7, work until Vivian arrived, move through the day's operational demands, and then stay after 6 and do the actual building. Those evenings had a particular texture that I thought about later when I was trying to understand what I had made and why it mattered in the way it mattered. The office at 9 p.m. was cold in the specific way of spaces cooled for machines rather than people. The cleaning crew came through at 7:30 and left the place with a faint chemical smell that dissipated by 9. After that, it was just the hum of the servers, the sound of the city at a reduced register, and the screen. And I worked the way I had always worked on problems that required the full of my attention. In silence, without music, with a single cup of coffee that I made when I arrived and forgot about until it was cold. I didn't outline. I built forward, which meant sometimes building a full sequence of logic only to discover at hour 3 that the foundation of it was wrong, and tearing it back to where it had diverged from what the problem actually required. That process felt like waste when it was happening. Looking back, those were the hours where I understood the problem most precisely. Well, the problem was this: making a complex financial interface navigable to users with wildly varying levels of financial literacy, without condescending to the sophisticated users or losing the novice ones, required solving 2 contradictory design problems simultaneously. The novice needed protection from complexity. The expert needed access to it. A single fixed interface could serve one or the other, but not both. Every existing solution I had examined chose a side and managed the other group's frustration with supplementary documentation and tooltips that no one read. The layered architecture was the answer, arrived at over 6 evenings in the 3rd week of the engagement. It allowed the interface to meet each user at the level of complexity they were demonstrating through their behavior, rather than the level a designer had predetermined for them. The system read behavior as intention. A user who drilled directly into a transaction detail in the first 30 seconds of a session was, by that action, demonstrating a level of financial fluency that unlocked a different structural layer than the one available to a user who hovered on the overview panel for 2 minutes before doing anything. By the time I had it fully working, it was doing something I hadn't anticipated when I started. It was adjusting not just the information it surfaced, but the structure of the choices it offered in real time, based on the accumulated signal of everything the user had done in the session. It was not AI in the technical sense. There was no model, no training data, no inference. It was a logic system, but it felt, as to a user interacting with it, like something that was paying attention to them. That quality, the feeling of being attended to by an interface, was what Elena described in her end-of-project note as the reason the portal had performed beyond every benchmark she had set for it. I did not tell Vivian how the system worked at the level I have just described. She knew what it did. She could describe what it did to a client with precision and clarity. The underlying structure was the part she found less interesting than the outcome it produced, which was a fair division of attention given our respective roles. But it meant that the thing she was selling without fully understanding what she was selling. Which was fine, until it wasn't. Vivian ran the client relationship with Wyndham and was extraordinary at it. She had a particular skill for translating what I was building into language that made the client feel informed rather than managed. Technical updates that, delivered by me, would have landed as dense and abstract became, in her framing, evidence of competence and progress. Clients trusted her. They trusted her in the specific way that people trust someone who makes them feel their interests are being considered, which is a different and more commercially durable thing than being trusted because you're competent. Together, for those 6 months, we were as effective as we had ever been. What I did not account for, coming into the Wyndham engagement, was Conrad. Conrad Hargrove was the Wyndham Group Deputy Director who sat in on our mid-project reviews. 38 years old, and the specific tailoring and measured authority of someone who had spent 15 years in institutional finance and had the confidence of a man who had rarely been told no by anyone he found worth pursuing. He was not our primary contact. That was the CTO, a quiet woman named Elena, who had deep technical knowledge and a dry humor I had respected from the first meeting. Conrad attended reviews as a governance presence. He found Vivian immediately interesting. I noticed it the way I had trained myself to notice things, accurately, without the distortion that comes from deciding in advance what you're looking at. He redirected questions to her even when the question required technical knowledge she didn't have, and I was sitting 3 feet away. She began arriving to Wyndham meetings in a different register than she arrived to internal ones, more prepared in some ways, differently attended in others. A specific laugh appeared in his presence that I hadn't encountered before, lighter and faster than the laugh I knew. She started responding to messages from his work address within minutes, where other correspondents from that level at the client sometimes waited until morning. I noticed, also, the specific way the engagement changed character in the back half of the project. Review sessions began featuring Conrad more centrally, offering strategic opinions on product decisions that were not within the scope of Wyndham's engagement with us. He had the confidence of a man who understood that institutional authority applied in a room with enough frequency just eventually reads as expertise. I watched this happen without commenting on it. I completed the interface system. The Wyndham portal launched on schedule, under budget, and outperformed every engagement metric in the first 60 days. Elena sent a note saying it was the best vendor engagement she had managed in 8 years. 3 referral calls came in over the following 3 months. Conrad attended the launch dinner. Vivian introduced him as a friend of the firm, which was accurate in the narrowest sense. I shook his hand. I noted the specific way she positioned herself slightly closer to him than the square footage of the room required. I spent 40 minutes talking to Elena about data architecture, and then drove home alone. I sat in my car in the driveway for 11 minutes before going inside. I was not performing composure. I was genuinely in the part of the process that precedes decisions, the part where you make sure you are seeing things as they are rather than as they feel. The emotional inventory was completed quickly because the conclusion was clear. The relationship had moved into territory it could not move back from, probably for longer than I had acknowledged. The operational inventory took longer because the operational questions were more complicated. I called Patricia the next morning. She was at her desk. I told her I wanted a fresh review of the shareholder agreement. Not for any specific reason I needed to name out loud. Just a review. She called back in less than 2 days. She told me the right of first refusal clause was solid, the IP assignment section was solid, and the vesting schedule had a cliff issue that had already passed its relevant date. What concerned her was the operational authority framework and the absence of any deadlock resolution mechanism for strategic disagreements. "You've never needed it," she said. "But if you do, there's no clean path." What does no clean path mean specifically? It means that if you two disagree about a major strategic decision, a sale, an acquisition, a pivot, and neither of you blinks, you'd need court intervention to resolve it. That takes time and money and tends to damage whatever you're fighting over. After I hung up, I spent 2 weeks doing something I should have done at incorporation. A complete audit of every document Aldercroft had ever generated. Every proposal, every signed contract, every NDA, every vendor agreement, every letter of engagement. I was not looking for problems. I was establishing a complete, accurate picture of what existed. The conclusion was uncomfortable in a specific way. The interface framework, the intellectual property at the center of every significant engagement we had run, and at the center of the Wyndham portal, which was already the firm's defining work, had been built on company time using company infrastructure. Under standard legal analysis, a court would most likely assign it to the entity. Not to me personally. If there were ever a disputed exit, the IP would be Aldercroft Designs, not Rowan's. Unless I had assigned it to myself before building it, which would have required a formal IP assignment agreement, signed before the work began, designating me as the owner with the company holding a license. But I had not done that. I made a note. I called Patricia. Retrospective IP assignment is possible, she said carefully, but it needs to be structured correctly, documented, reasonable, not constructed in a way that could be characterized as designed to prejudice an active dispute. There's no dispute. Then there is no better time than now, she said. She explained the mechanism. I would create a separate holding entity, a sister company to Aldercroft Design. The interface framework, as a discrete and identifiable IP asset, would be formally assigned to that entity by the person who had created it. Me, in my individual capacity, the original author under whose credentials every committed version was documented. The holding entity would then grant Aldercroft Design a perpetual, royalty-free operational license for all its client work. The license would be unrestricted. The studio could use the framework on every engagement it ran, forever, without payment. The effect was that the IP would sit in a company I owned entirely, rather than in a company I owned 51% of. The practical impact on Aldercroft Design's day-to-day operation, 0. The practical impact on Aldercroft Design's IP position in the event of a disputed exit, total. The framework is the asset, Patricia said. Whoever holds the framework holds the value. Right now, the value is inside a company with 2 owners. We're moving it into a company with 1. What's the exposure? There isn't meaningful exposure if it's done correctly and documented correctly. It's not unusual for technical founders to hold IP in a separate vehicle. The license makes it clean for the studio. And as long as there's no active dispute and the resolution is genuinely arm's length, it's standard practice. And if she noticed and objected? She'd have a difficult case, Patricia said. The license is complete and royalty-free. She loses nothing operationally. Her objection would be to the valuation. She'd argue the company is worth less without direct IP ownership. But the license is perpetual. Any valuation expert would factor it in. I thought about this. Do it, I said. Over the following 6 weeks, while Vivian was traveling for a new business campaign she had initiated without bringing me into the planning, 3 cities, 4 pitches, a level of independent operational initiative that was itself information, I restructured. Nothing I did was concealed. Everything was filed, documented, and technically visible to any party reviewing the company's corporate records. The question was whether anyone was looking, based on the way Vivian had been operating for the past year. The answer was that she was paying attention to the parts of the business she found interesting and had grown comfortable trusting me with the rest. That trust, in this specific instance, was a mechanism. I incorporated Aldercroft Systems as a separate legal entity and assigned the interface framework to it as its primary asset. Aldercroft Design received a perpetual, royalty-free operational license. The studio could use the framework freely, indefinitely, for all client work. No cost, no restrictions. This was standard IP hygiene for a technology-adjacent design firm, and there was nothing unusual about it on its face. Patricia drafted the board resolution. As co-director of Aldercroft Design, Vivian was required to co-sign it for the transaction to be complete. I put the papers in front of her on a Tuesday morning. She was on a call when I walked into her office, talking to someone she addressed by first name, with a warmth I recognized as her specific voice for relationships she considered social. I set the documents beside her, pointed to the signature line, and waited. She signed them without reading them. She continued the call without interruption. The pen moved across 3 pages, each signature placed with the casual fluency of someone who has signed enough documents to make the act reflexive. There had been a time, in the first year, when she had reviewed everything I brought her. She had been attentive and precise, full of questions, just occasionally resistant, always ultimately thorough. Somewhere in the second year, that had changed. The documents had become routine. The act of signing had become a delegation of trust rather than an exercise of judgment. I had watched this happen over months. I had never said anything about it, because the documents in question had not, until now, required her attention in the way that this one did. I had the notarized copies in Patricia's files by the end of the day. By late spring, the situation with Conrad had moved past the stage where I was inferring it from behavioral cues and into the stage where it was simply a fact I had confirmed directly, by accident. I had returned to the office at 8 p.m. to retrieve a hard drive I'd left on my desk. The conference room lights were on. The blinds were half drawn, and I could see enough through the gap to understand the nature of what was happening. I stood in the corridor for 4 seconds. Then I walked to my desk, took the hard drive, and left without turning on any lights or closing any doors. I drove to a diner I had been going to since I was 19. One of those places with red vinyl booths worn soft with use, coffee in a ceramic mug that had been refilled 10,000 times, a menu board that hadn't been updated since the 90s. I sat in the corner booth for an hour and 15 minutes with eggs I didn't particularly want. What I was doing in that hour and 15 minutes was a final inventory. Not of loss. I was past the point where loss was the relevant category, of the actual current state of each thing that mattered. The company, real, growing, well-regarded, and the IP, properly structured and assigned, sitting in an entity she had no equity in. The relationship. Over in every meaningful sense. The exit, the last open question. I called Patricia from the parking lot. "It's time," I said. A brief pause. She knew my voice across a range of registers, and she understood this one without needing clarification. "I've been expecting this call," she said. "What's the sequence? First, you decide what outcome you're protecting. Controlling stake in the company? Clean exit? IP licensing on its own?" I had been thinking about this for weeks. The company, without me in it, would not be the same company. Vivian was talented, but she had been working, for the past year, in a way that depended on my technical foundation and Conrad's particular interest in the business. But I had no affection for the outcome where she ran it into something smaller, and I watched from a distance. "Clean exit," I said. "Sale of my stake to a qualified buyer, on the right terms, at fair value, with everything documented correctly." "Then we start with evaluation," she said, "and you need to trigger the ROFR before anything else moves." The right of first refusal clause was in Section 7.4 of the shareholder agreement. We had both initialed every page. It said, in plain language, that before either party transferred shares to a third party, the other party had the right to purchase those shares first, at the same price and terms. The receiving party had 30 calendar days from written notice to exercise that right. Non-response within the window constituted a waiver by operation of the agreement. It had seemed, was when we signed it, like the kind of clause that belongs in every shareholder agreement and that neither party ever expects to need. Patricia engaged an independent valuation firm. The process was rigorous and took 6 weeks. They reviewed 3 years of financials, all client contracts, growth projections, competitive landscape, the IP structure, key personnel dependencies. The firm delivered a valuation just under $9 million for Aldercroft Design as a going concern. My 51% was valued at approximately $4,600,000. That number was, I believed, conservative. The Wyndham portal was outperforming every comparable product the client had deployed in the past decade, and the word had spread to adjacent firms in the sector in ways that were starting to appear in inbound inquiry volume. What the framework at the center of that portal was now an Aldercroft Systems asset, not an Aldercroft Design asset. Simultaneously, Patricia made a quiet introduction to Pendleton Capital, a private equity firm that specialized in acquiring controlling stakes in professional services firms at exactly the inflection point Aldercroft had reached. The connection came through a former colleague on Pendleton's advisory board. The initial conversation was informal. Pendleton had reviewed the Wyndham portal. Their technology consultant had spent a day with the codebase and come back with a brief that Patricia later showed me, in which she had underlined one sentence: "The underlying architecture represents a structural advantage that cannot be quickly replicated by a competitor." The preliminary offer came at $4,600,000. What with a negotiation provision, Pendleton believed would close closer to $5 million. Separately, through a board-level introduction at Wyndham that Patricia had cultivated with careful patience over 4 months, a different conversation was developing. Wyndham Group was in the process of spinning out an internal software division into a standalone product company. They needed a design infrastructure with real technical depth. They had been using the interface framework through the original portal engagement, and their internal performance data made its contribution unmistakable. They wanted to license it commercially for the new subsidiary. The licensing rights were held by Aldercroft Systems. The transaction was entirely separate from Aldercroft Design. It would have no impact on the studio's operational license. The commercial license value, $4.2 million against a tiered royalty structure. Vivian had no equity in Aldercroft Systems. She had co-signed the formation resolution, the IP assignment, and the license agreement on a Tuesday morning without reading them. I wrote the ROFR notice myself. It was my most carefully constructed document of that year. Patricia adjusted 3 places in the legal language and approved the rest. The notice stated, formally and completely, that I intended to transfer my 51% interest to a qualified buyer, that I was triggering Section 7.4, that Vivian had 30 calendar days from the date of formal delivery to elect to purchase my shares at $4,600,000 under the terms of the attached term sheet. The term sheet was real, and Pendleton Capital was the named buyer. At the end of the formal section, I included a personal paragraph. Patricia asked if it was necessary. I said it wasn't legally necessary. She waited. I told her I wanted Vivian to understand, at the moment she read it, that I had been paying attention. That the letter was the one direct communication we would have about the actual truth of what had happened, and I did not want it to be entirely transactional. I had written personal correspondence maybe 6 times in my adult life. Notes attached to gifts, 1 letter to a professor I had respected, a note to my father after a difficult conversation we'd had that I hadn't handled well. Each time, I had been aware of the specific exposure of writing something in your own voice without the buffer of professional register. Yet you cannot revise feeling out of a sentence the way you can revise ambiguity out of a contract clause. You can contain it, but the container is visible. I wrote a first version late on a Tuesday night and read it the following morning and discarded it. It had been too careful. It had the quality of a statement prepared by someone anticipating how it would be read, rather than by someone trying to say something true. The second version I wrote in a single sitting on a Thursday evening at my kitchen table, and I knew when I reached the end of it that it was the version I was going to send. I wrote that I had valued building the company with her, that I thought we had made something real, and that my appreciation for what she had contributed to it was genuine and hadn't changed. That I was leaving because the terms of the partnership had changed in ways that weren't workable for me, and that I wanted the exit to be fair to both of us. That the offer in the letter was a fair price, and that the alternative, a contested process, a legal dispute, the disruption to the firm itself, was not something I wanted for either of us. And that I had watched her sign documents without reading them for the better part of a year. That I was asking her, once, directly, not to do that with this one. That she should call Patricia with every question she had. That the offer was generous, and the alternative wasn't something I was willing to want for her. I sealed it and handed it to a certified document delivery service at 9 a.m. on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of October. Time-stamped electronic receipt, GPS confirmation of address, signature log. All of it preserved in Patricia's files. I went to the office at 11 a.m. I had decided to deliver it in person as well. Not as the formal service, which was complete, but because I thought she deserved to be able to look at me and make a decision about how to respond. I thought it was the decent thing to offer. I had thought about it for 2 weeks, and it was still the conclusion I arrived at. The afternoon light in the 3rd week of October came through the west windows at an angle that turned the reception area gold for about 45 minutes each day. It was that 45 minutes when I arrived. The lavender diffuser was running. The office smelled the way it had smelled every day I had worked in it for 3 years. Conrad was at the conference table. Thus he had been appearing at the office with growing regularity. A client meeting here, a strategy session Vivian had invited him to consult on there, an occasional presence that had grown from infrequent to regular without ever being formally explained. But sitting at the conference table with a personal coffee mug and an open laptop at 11 a.m. on a Thursday was a different quality of presence than any of those. It was the presence of someone who had decided, or been invited, to regard the space as partly his. His jacket was draped over the arm of a chair near the window. A chair that had been informally mine in the spatial grammar of the room for 3 years. Vivian was at her desk. She looked up when I came in. I crossed the room and set the envelope on the conference table in front of her. "This requires your attention," I said. "Oh, the response deadline been 30 calendar days from today. You should read it carefully and call Patricia if you have questions." She looked at the envelope. Her name was typed on the front in the plain font of the courier service. She picked it up and turned it over, looking at the sealed flap. Then she looked at Conrad. It was a brief exchange, less than 2 seconds. Something passing between them that had the specific quality of a prior agreement being confirmed. He gave something close to a nod, the kind of movement that isn't visible from across a room unless you have been watching closely for a long time. She looked back at me. The expression she wore was one I had catalogued over 3 years, the one she deployed when she had decided to perform confidence rather than locate it. She turned the envelope over again in her hands. For a moment I genuinely thought she was going to open it. Then she tore it down the center, not dramatically, not with force. A measured, deliberate tear, then a second one, so she held 4 roughly equal pieces. She set them on the table in a small pile, edges aligned, the way you set aside something you've already dealt with and are done with. "I think we both know where this partnership stands," she said. I looked at the pile of paper on the table. Then I looked at her. 30 days, I said. And I walked out. I sat in my car in the parking structure for a long time. The engine was off, The structure smelled like exhaust and cement dust. I was not frozen. I was processing, in the specific way I processed things that required a full accounting before I could move. Well, there was a weight in my chest that I didn't have a name for that was precise enough. Not grief, exactly, and not anger, something that sits between those two things when they're both present, but neither one is in charge. The feeling of having been right about something you had genuinely, specifically, not wanted to be right about. I drove to Patricia's office. She was still there. She kept hours that I had long stopped being surprised by. Her office smelled like old paper and the last cup of tea she'd brewed, which was usually something strong. I sat down across from her desk and told her. She tore it, I said. Patricia was quiet for a moment. In front of him? Yes. She wrote something on her notepad. And then she put the pen down and looked at me with an expression I had come to associate with the particular calm of someone who has prepared for a contingency and is now simply moving through it. The courier completed formal service at 9 a.m., she said. The electronic receipt, the GPS log, the signature confirmation, all preserved. The physical copy has no bearing on service. The clock started this morning. I know, I said. She has 30 days, Patricia said. Yes. I went home. I sat in my kitchen for a long time. I didn't eat. I had a glass of water that I didn't touch. I was thinking about the paragraph I had written, the personal one at the end of the letter, and about the fact that she had tore it up before she could have read past the first line. The following 30 days passed the way institutional time passes, with a slowness that has a specific texture to it, more like weight than duration. I went to the office each day. I completed every piece of work assigned to me with full professional attention. I reviewed every proposal Vivian brought to me honestly, because my opinion of her work had never required my opinion of her to be positive, and several of the pitches she was developing during this period were genuinely well constructed. I was aware, during those 30 days, of the specific way she was watching me. Not directly. She had never been direct about the things that made her uncertain, but I could feel the monitoring in the room, the slight adjustment in the way she occupied space when I was near. She was waiting to see if I would escalate, if I would confront her, or Conrad, or the situation. If the letter had been, as Conrad apparently told her, a pressure tactic designed to produce a reaction she could respond to. I did not confront anyone. I showed up. I did the work. I let the clock run. Conrad was in the office more frequently as the weeks passed. He had acquired a permanent coffee mug, a personal one, blue with a slight chip on the handle, which sat on the kitchen counter with the naturalness of an object that has been in a place long enough to stop being noticed. He had opinions about the project management software we used and had apparently shared them with Vivian because one Tuesday morning it had been replaced with a different platform, and I had been informed by email. He sat in on a client call without being introduced. And I watched Vivian not introduce him in a way that was its own kind of introduction. There was one afternoon in the second week, when I found them reviewing what appeared to be a set of financial projections I hadn't prepared. The documents were spread across the conference table, and Conrad was pointing at figures on a page while Vivian made notes. I walked past the conference room to the kitchen, poured a coffee, and returned to my desk. I did not ask about the documents. They did not offer to explain them. I made a note of the date and the fact of the documents. I sent Patricia a brief message that evening. Note this date. Note that financial projections are being prepared or reviewed by a non-company party without my involvement. She responded in 3 words, noted and logged. As I observed all of it with a detachment that I understood, from the outside, probably read as resignation. That was fine. In this specific situation, the appearance of resignation had a practical value. On day 22, Patricia sent the formal ROFR reminder notice to the registered business address, as required by the notification clause of the agreement. It stated the original notice date, the response deadline, and Patricia's direct contact number. It was brief and entirely procedural. No response came. Day 30 arrived, then passed. The right of first refusal expired at 11:59 p.m. on its 30th day by operation of the agreement's plain language. No election had been made. No counteroffer, no communication, no contact with Patricia of any kind. I was in my apartment when the clock crossed midnight on day 30, and I had set nothing up to mark the moment. There was no ceremony to it. I had been reading, a book I had been meaning to finish for 3 months, and I noted the time, set the book down for a moment, and then kept reading. Under Section 7.4, the consequence was unambiguous. The right was waived. I was legally free to transfer my shares to any qualified buyer at any price on any terms. I called Patricia the following morning. "It's done," I said. "Yes," she said. "I'm filing the expiry record this morning. We can move to the Pendleton Close." "How long?" 6 weeks, if they stay on schedule. They're motivated. I'll push where I can." "And the Wyndham deal?" "Parallel track. Their counsel wants to run both closings in the same week. I think that's fine." I thanked her. She said she'd call me when there was something to call about. The Pendleton transaction closed over the following 6 weeks. Due diligence was thorough in the way that institutional capital is thorough. Financial records going back to incorporation. All client contracts reviewed for change of control provisions. The IP structure, examined by Pendleton's Technology Council for 2 full days before they were satisfied. There were 3 rounds of document revision. Patricia held the line on every representation and warranty that Pendleton's counsel pushed to broaden beyond what the facts supported, with a patience I had come to understand was a deliberate technique rather than a temperamental characteristic. The final negotiated price was $5,100,000. The negotiation took 12 days. It was the most expensive 12 days of Patricia's billing that I had ever seen, and it was worth considerably more than it cost. The Wyndham Systems licensing deal was finalized in the same week. The Wyndham legal team was experienced, and the negotiation was substantive, but not adversarial. The framework documentation was complete, the IP chain of title was unimpeachable, and the operational license to Aldercroft Design had been drafted with enough precision that there was nothing for anyone to contest in good faith. On December 19th, Pendleton Capital formally acquired my 51% controlling interest in Aldercroft Design. On December 20th, Patricia's office sent Vivian a formal notification letter. The letter explained the elapsed ROFR period, the completed share transfer, Pendleton's new majority position, the appointment of a new managing director, and the fact that Vivian retained her 49% interest subject to the existing shareholder agreement. It noted the Aldercroft Systems licensing transaction in a single factual sentence. I spent Christmas at my parents' house for the first time in 4 years. My mother made the same lamb dish she had made every December of my childhood. My father and I sat on the back porch in the cold for an hour after dinner, talking about nothing in particular. The way you talk when you don't need the other person to understand the full context, just to be present in the same space. He asked me once whether I was all right. I said yes. He looked at me for a moment, and then looked at the winter garden and said, "Good." That was enough. By late January, I had moved into a new office, smaller than the Aldercroft studio, quieter, a single room on the third floor of a converted building with a window that faced a courtyard where the building's maintenance team had planted, with a kind of stubborn optimism that I respected without entirely understanding. A persimmon tree. I began building a second framework, structurally different from the first, designed for a different application layer entirely, a different category of user decision-making, a different kind of complexity that the first framework had not been designed to address. The kind of work I liked best. Structural, largely invisible until you took it away, essential in proportion to its invisibility. The months between January and November were the quietest stretch of working time I had experienced in years. I had, for the first time since incorporating Aldercroft, no obligations that weren't ones I had chosen. No co-director to coordinate with. No client relationship to balance against a technical judgment. No space where the work I was doing was one component of something that someone else's presence was the other component of. I worked long hours and felt none of the exhaustion that long hours had produced at Aldercroft, because the hours were entirely mine. I ate at the diner 2 or 3 times a week. I called my parents on Sundays. I had a small number of friendships that I had been maintaining at a reduced level during the Aldercroft years, and that, in their gradual renewal, felt like putting weight on a foot that had gone numb. I did not think about Vivian or the company often. When I did, it was without the specific weight that had characterized my thinking about it during the 30 days. It had become, by spring, simply a prior chapter. Real, formative, finished. The call came in late November, almost exactly a year after I had set that envelope on the conference table. I was at my desk. The persimmon tree outside had shed most of its leaves but still held its fruit, that specific burnt orange against a gray November sky, a color that shouldn't survive the surrounding gray but does. My phone showed Vivian's name. I let it ring 4 times before I answered. "You need to tell me what was in that letter," she said. No greeting, no preamble. Her voice had the specific pitch of someone who has recently arrived at an understanding they cannot reverse. "It was a right of first refusal notice," I said. "On Section 7.4 of the shareholder agreement, you had 30 days to elect to purchase my 51% interest at $4,600,000, matching the Pendleton term sheet." A silence. 4.6, she said, as if saying the number aloud was a step in making it real. Yes. Pendleton paid more than that. The final negotiated price was $5,100,000. Another silence. Longer. "And the systems company," she said. "Aldercroft Systems. You co-signed the formation resolution in the first quarter of last year, the IP assignment, the license agreement." A pause with a specific quality, not confusion, but the recognition of a shape she had seen before and not examined. "I didn't read those," she said. "No," I said. I said it without inflection, without weight or edge. "Domsvam." It was the most precise thing I could say about what had happened, and I said it as precisely as I could. "The Wyndham licensing deal," she said. Her voice had changed register slightly, not breaking, but under a particular kind of pressure. "How much?" "That's a matter between Aldercroft Systems and Wyndham Group." "Rowan." $4.2 million up front," I said, "against a tiered royalty structure. The 5-year projection on the royalties is significant." The silence this time lasted long enough that I checked the screen to confirm the call hadn't dropped. "I went to a lawyer in January," she said finally. "After the Pendleton notification. He looked at the ROFR clause and told me the physical copy being torn meant the notice wasn't formally served. Your lawyer was wrong, I said. Formal service was completed by the courier at 9 a.m. the morning of delivery. Time-stamped electronic receipt, GPS confirmation, signature log. The physical copy has no bearing on service under the agreement's notification clause. Patricia can provide documentation if your counsel wants to review it. A pause. I know, she said quietly. He told me that eventually, after he saw the courier records. You had 30 days from the morning of delivery, I said. The framework is in the agreement. It existed for both of us. I understand that. Patricia was available. Her number was in the letter. The term sheet was attached. The valuation summary was attached. Everything you needed to make a decision was in that envelope. I tore it up, she said. Not to me exactly, to the fact of it. Yes. Before I read it, yes. A long pause. And then, Pendleton has made it clear they want me operationally removed by March. They've appointed a director whose role and mine apparently overlap in ways he's not inclined to navigate around. I know. A brief stillness on the line. You know? Patricia keeps me informed of material governance developments. My representations in the Pendleton agreement include a 6-month period. Is there anything... She started the sentence and then seemed to decide against how she'd intended to finish it. What's my position? Your 49% without the controlling stake is a minority interest in a company with a majority owner on a defined return timeline, I said. You'd need to buy Pendleton out at a price they'd accept, or find a buyer for your stake that they'd approve. Both are possible in theory. What would my stake sell for? I thought about how to say the next thing. There was no formulation that changed what it was. Less than it would have been worth to you 12 months ago, I said. She was quiet for a moment. 4.6, she said again. Quietly, with the specific quality of a number being placed somewhere permanent. Yes. I could have had $4.6 million and 100% of a firm that Pendleton subsequently valued at 9. You could have owned it outright, I said. Pendleton only entered because you didn't respond. I let her hold that without filling the silence. When she spoke again, her voice had the quality of someone choosing precision over comfort. He told me to tear it up, she said. Conrad told me you were creating a pressure document. So that you'd sent something designed to make me respond in a way you could use against me. He said to let the period expire and ignore it. I understood, in that moment, the full architecture of what had happened on that Thursday afternoon in the gold light. The look between them before she tore it, the small confirming nod, the performance of confidence, and the clean pile of pieces on the table. She had been advised. Not by someone acting in her interest, by someone for whom her engagement with that letter would have created complications. A man who had spent months in and around the firm's financials, who had sat in on enough client reviews to understand the company's value, who had specific reasons to want my exit to be contested and messy, rather than executed cleanly on documented terms. A man who had, possibly, been thinking about his own position in the company's future in ways that required my position to be uncertain. I filed that thought. He knew what the company was worth, I said. He'd been in enough reviews. He'd seen the Wyndham account. He had access to information that would have told him, fairly precisely, what my 51% represented and what the framework licensing potential was. She didn't respond immediately. He was protecting something, she said. It wasn't a question. That's a conversation for you and your counsel, I said. I don't have a view on it. A silence. The personal note, she said, at the end of the letter. What did it say? I was standing at the window by then. The persimmon tree was still, the sky behind it having shifted from gray to the flat white that means rain in late November. Thus, I had written that paragraph in one sitting, late at night, at my kitchen table with a glass of water I hadn't touched. I had not read it again after Patricia approved the document. I remembered it the way you remember something written from a place more honest than strategy. It said I had valued building the company with her, I said. That I thought what we made was real. That my appreciation for what she contributed hadn't changed. That I was leaving because the terms of the partnership had changed in ways that weren't workable. And that I wanted the exit to be fair to both of us. She was quiet. It said the offer was a fair price, and that a contested exit wasn't something I wanted for either of us. It said she should take the full 30 days and call Patricia with every question she had. I paused. And it said I had watched her sign documents without reading them for the better part of a year, and that I was asking her, once, directly, not to do that with this one. The sound on the other end of the line was not a word. It was something quieter than that. A breath held, and then released in a way that contained more than breath. You wrote that you were asking me once, she said. Yes. And I tore it up. Yes. In front of him. I didn't say anything. I did it as a performance, she said. To show him I wasn't, that I was on his side, that I wasn't going to be managed by you. I let that sit in the air between us. The thing is, she said slowly, he left in March, 2 weeks after the Pendleton notification came. He just stopped being present, stopped answering calls with any particular urgency. I think that when the majority stake moved to Pendleton, he understood there was nothing left in the situation for him. I had thought this might be the case. I had thought it in the parking structure on the afternoon she tore the letter, and I had thought it more clearly in the months since. That's a conclusion your counsel should help you examine, I said, specifically in the context of any fiduciary responsibilities he had as a quasi-advisor to the firm. Another long pause. You're not going to say anything else, she said. Not quite a question. Everything that needed saying was in the documents, I said. It was always in the documents. She said my name, just my name, the way you say a word you've been not saying for a long time. I waited. I'm sorry, she said. I did not soften. I was not performing hardness either, and it was simply that the apology arrived into a space where it was accurate and noted and changed nothing that had already been determined by the sequence of events. I know, I said, and I ended the call. I stood at the window for a few minutes after. The persimmon tree in the courtyard had a specific quality in that November light. Fruit hanging on bare branches against a white sky, that deep orange-red that shouldn't survive the gray surrounding it, but does. I had been watching it from this window since January. It had fruited for the second time since I'd moved in, and I had watched the whole arc of it, the leaves, the green fruit, the slow turn toward orange, the bare branches with the fruit still hanging after everything else had gone. The thing about a properly constructed exit is that there is nothing afterward. What that remains unresolved on your side, every document filed, dated, witnessed, preserved, every notice delivered by the mechanism the agreement prescribed, every deadline tracked to the hour, every mechanism executed with the precision it was designed for. The right of first refusal had existed in that shareholder agreement for the express purpose of protecting both parties, me from an unwanted co-owner, her from a forced sale on someone else's terms. It had done exactly what it was built to do. I had triggered it correctly. She had chosen not to engage with it on the advice of someone whose interest in her choice was not her own. I had not designed the outcome. I had designed the structure and documented the mechanism. The outcome followed from a choice she made on a Thursday afternoon in gold October light, so holding a letter she had not read, with someone beside her who had specific reasons to watch it be destroyed. Patricia's message appeared while I was still at the window. 3 words. Pendleton confirmed March. I put the phone in my pocket. The persimmon fruit was going to fall soon. Another few weeks, maybe less, and they'd be on the ground. I had been thinking about being in the courtyard when it happened. Not because it was meaningful, because there was something in watching a thing complete its full arc, without looking away, that I had always found useful, not instructive, just honest. I went back to my desk and opened the file for the second framework. There was work to do.
Get it? Like, you get the best sleep on morphine. Like, you just knock out.
Medic!
This is kind of weird being on early because, obviously everybody is at work or sleeping.
Fuck! Need a medic!
Why am I here? That's what I'm asking, Tank. Not why you're here, why am I here? But I said if I stream early today, then I should be done. What third of the US are you in? I mean, third? You mean like West, Midwest, and East? I'm in the East.